So, hi, I'm Rex Kamek. I'm the chair of this session, and I'll be giving the poorest of the four papers. So that'll be the third one, so you can sleep during that one. And we're going to start out. Our first presenter is online, and it's Christina. And I'll let Christina introduce herself and her talk, and let's get started.
Okay, thanks so much. Hi, this is Christy, Christy Caudle. I'm going to be talking to you about really meeting the challenges of the Sustainable Development Goals, but this is of relevance to so many things that we've been talking about in this session. Is this particularly of relevance to ethical considerations with cartography? And I just want to say I appreciate that so many presenters thus far have been talking about community-based efforts. And I really think that's what most of this is about, meaning global agendas like Sustainable Development Goals. They particularly affect these climate crises. They're wreaking havoc across the world. They particularly affect marginalized communities. They're least prepared to deal with these things. And those are the people that we need to be mapping for. So this is a quote from the Secretary General of the UN. I think this was in 2018 when he addressed the UNGGIM, which many of you probably know. It's the United Nations Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management. And this committee is really tasked with how do we use GIS, cartography, remote sensing, how do we use all of this for a kind of coherent knowledge infrastructure to help meet the SDGs? Because, of course, high quality, reliable geospatial information really underpins both national and global policies. But there are some problems with this. Who are we doing this mapping for, right? So there's this particular relevance to indigenous communities. So when we talk about climate change, it's important to recognize that 80% of the world's biodiversity is linked to indigenous communities. And a growing body of evidence supports that this bottom-up community-based projects, that these are the ones that immediately affect the lives of people, and that this bottom-up approach has this aggregate effect towards global goals. And the idea is that in this kind of distributed system where you have many different points of focus, many different communities, many different sectors in society who have these capacities to use cartography, they act as different focal points in a system that becomes really resilient because you have this emergent outcome as aggregate agency. So that's the idea of it's not just an idea, it's kind of what we're seeing in research, is that when you affect the lives of people, a community, it has this effect going up. And there's an important part to recognize about indigenous knowledge. And I am a white person and I cannot tell these stories, but I think this is a great opportunity for all of us to maybe even be uncomfortable and say some things that maybe are pretty obvious and we all feel. But speaking for people who traditionally haven't had a voice, and indigenous communities included in this. Some of the challenges with the Sustainable Development Goals, it's really about developing an infrastructure where we can all share knowledge, gain new knowledge and insights, and to support all sectors of society, including at the community level. But a problem that's been identified with the Sustainable Development Goals frameworks, they've been criticized for lacking cultural sensitivity and applicability to the complex environmental problems that are faced by local communities all around the world, but including indigenous and with particular reference to indigenous communities. The SDGs, they have this recurring emphasis on sustainable, on GDP, and that risks undermining indigenous people's holistic development approaches and their ecological sustainability practices. So this is a real challenge. And how do we create policies and a geospatial infrastructure to help communities and bring their views to the table so that these same peoples aren't left behind again. Just a couple of quotes here I think are of relevance really quickly. Someone that's really influenced me and I think is of particular relevance in this kind of turning point that I think I see cartography really in is Gregory Bateson, who's a cyberneticist. And this was from Steps to an Ecology of the Mind from the 70s, talking about technological solutions and that to caution that, you know, when we're faced with some kind of impossible scenario like we are now, rather than, you know, suggesting purely technological solutions, instead kind of shift how we employ those technologies for the better. He says that the result of the world's problems are the difference between how nature works and the way that people think. And I'll just quickly note a quote from Stephanie Piran. She did an incredible project with Fraser Taylor at GCRC Carleton University, the residential school Land Memory Atlas. She suggests that cartography is in this midst of an ontological crisis, looking at actually taking Indigenous communities doing their own mapping, their own cartography. And this is a real relational approach. It's a narrative-based relational approach. And it's a very different way of doing mapping. And maybe we're at this kind of inflection point where these different worldviews are coming together. And she says that this is all about ethics and all about a moral consciousness, and particular relevance to the material of this conference. So what should we do moving forward? There are a few, of course, we've talked a lot about the ethical and trustful use of Earth observation, remote sensing, and cartography. And a few people we've heard from so far in this conference have talked about Indigenous mapping, Indigenous communities using those tools for themselves. And there are these research validated methodologies. So, you know, first I might talk about, luckily this work has been done and it is already being done. It's decades-long work in participatory mapping and cyber cartography that Fraser Taylor talked about. And there are guiding mechanisms and protocols, and those are the research-validated methodologies of knowledge co-production and working with communities. And so many of the presenters I've heard so far are talking about this real community-based work. And I love that Dr. Pratchett, sorry, I hope I'm getting that right, talked about, you know, when you're mapping for communities, we must consider that these are agents. These are active agents. I love that he put it that way. They're not objects. They're not just parts of the study that are outside of it, but involved in it and active in it and taking on that autonomously. I'll just go through this pretty quickly, just to say that, you know, we can move kind of beyond our traditional methods of making maps for populations, and it be a more back and forth, moving towards engagement and participation and true co-design of projects that meet people at the community level or whatever level that they're at. And again, these methods to recommend participatory mapping and knowledge co-production, I would direct you to the International Journal for Geoinformation. There's a 2022 special issue. Many of you may know it's Mapping Indigenous Knowledge in the Digital Age. And it is full of incredible case studies on these principles and co-design methodologies. And a few of those are described here. You know, it creates this two-way dialogue, and it can radically change the way that mapping is done and data is collected. The local communities build capacity, not only for natural, but for cultural preservation. And I wanted to mention something from Google Earth and Transition workshop that I heard that was fantastic to hear someone from NASA Applied Sciences talking about the work that they did with Anishinaabe Indigenous people here in Canada, and really talking about decolonizing the map. But this, of course, wasn't the explicit goal. But she said some things that were pretty striking from the person from Applied Sciences, saying, that these maps are, of course, full of colonial names, but the knowledge holders that they were talking to in the Indigenous communities, they told the stories, they did the dances, their traditional dances, and they told these stories, and they did it with satellite imagery. And it made for this really powerful dialogue where they brought in traditional knowledges that read the satellite data really accurately and with a lot more depth and context and relational information than could otherwise be known about it. And there are other fantastic examples too. One that comes to mind is Nature Canada's worked collaboratively with the Cree Nation Trappers Association. And so for years that the Cree Nation had pushed hard for to have some autonomy in land planning and governance authority. And since 2015, 50% of the critical biodiversity in their regions, in the marine regions that they were working with, had been restored through that project. And this is kind of participatory dialogue and mapping. So there are a few things also besides the research, validated methodologies and the case studies. There are a few basic tenets, basic principles that have been developed and can be applied. We all probably know about the FAIR principles. We've talked about these a bit: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Also, the CODATA Science Committee and the Indigenous Data Governance Group developed the CARE principles, which are of note. Collective benefit is something that I'll highlight there, and authority to control. I'll highlight this because this is not something that we've traditionally done. And the idea, I think, is really important at the very beginning of this conference. It was said that it's too constraining to have very black and white sets of rules or constraints, and I think that that's absolutely true, particularly since you need the flexibility. If everyone can be a map maker, and everyone should be a map keeper, you need that. I think we all need that flexibility. But if you are co-designing projects, instead of just speaking to governments, if you're speaking to communities and you're working with communities, everyone shows up at the table with these principles. And these principles are something that's spoken as an agreement between all parties. And besides CARE and FAIR, as Fraser Taylor mentioned in one of the plenaries, the First Nations people here in Ontario and Canada produced the OCAP principles, and the same is true for the protocols from the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And again, we keep hearing this kind of sentiment, this first one that is mentioned: nothing about us without us. And these are principles that are very important and critical. I mean, they have to be done. We show up to the table and work with and about Indigenous communities, but these are fantastic principles to carry through our work, no matter what communities that we're working with. So I think this is my last slide here, and just to kind of hit a few of these points again. How are we to proceed? Thinking about these ethical considerations and this transformation of cartography that we're in. And it may be helpful to think about, I sort of like thinking about the this transition point that we may be in with cartography. going back to this real turning point in philosophy, the Immanuel Kant, and even neurobiological research kind of supports that transition from Immanuel Kant. So what he was saying was that our sense perception has not really evolved to give us an accurate representation of reality, but it's just accurate enough to map out and navigate our reality as we need it for survival. So perhaps we can view the history of cartography in the same way. We've created maps that are accurate enough for us to navigate the world through one dominant worldview and one dominant perspective. And maybe what I'm suggesting, and that many people are suggesting, is that cartography is experiencing a similar transformation. And we kind of simply need to pivot to be able to adequately map out a world that's more complex and multitudinous and is really a strategy for everybody. And that includes, going to communities with people having other worldviews and real issues on the ground and asking what would support them, right? What strategies support them, and start projects from that. Okay, I think I'm actually under time. Maybe that's all I have for you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Christina. We're going to open it up for questions. We have time for a few. We have one in the back. Just a second.
Yeah, it's Dr. David A. Padgett, Tennessee State University. Really enjoyed your presentation. Question is, I've seen a lot of work done with a platform called OpenStreetMaps. I don't know if you've heard of it. I have my own opinions about OpenStreetMaps, but on the continuum from tech-centric versus human-centric, where do you think OpenStreetMap falls?
Well, that's such a great question. Yeah, I don't have, let me mute myself here. A lot of feedback. Okay, I don't have, I can't really address OpenStreetMap. I've heard a lot of great things about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts, maybe offline. But I think this kind of gets to really something that's important for these communities, and that it's been really important for them to use free and open source software, because that's the only way that they've been able to ensure that they can retain ownership of their data and their place names and everything that's really, important and sacred to them. And, because of this history of the way that cartography has been done, there's no trust there. So I think in this acknowledgement, we could move forward speaking to people instead of data. And if this is something that's recognized, if people are looking to use free and open source software because they explicitly need that ownership and control, I think we can approach it using these principles and mitigate that. Not sure if that at all speaks to OpenStreetMap. I'm sure it doesn't, but I'd love to hear your thoughts again about that offline.
Yeah, just in my opinion, OpenStreetMap does the exact opposite. It takes away ownership of the data from indigenous populations and puts it on a platform that they can't reach. Just my opinion, I've tried to use it, but I've also seen maybe in an emergency situation, like with the Mozambique floods, when you have an absolute dire situation and you have to have maps right now, it works very well then when, you're not worried about preserving anything except human life. But when you're starting to preserve cultural elements and ownership, I don't think OpenStreetMaps is the answer. Just my opinion.
I just want to say I really appreciate that opinion, and I think that these are exactly the kinds of conversations that we need to be having. We don't have any answers, and all of these things are evolving pretty quickly. But if we don't, have some ethical basis at the start of these conversations, I think we're going to keep finding ourselves in a lot of trouble. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, great. So we've run out of time. So if anybody has any questions, we may have some time at the end for Christy to answer. We'd like to move on now. So thank you, Christy.